Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, Madam Secretary, and let me just welcome you to the subcommittee for what is our second budget hearing of the year. And today we are examining the President's proposed budget for 2020 for the Department of Education. You've heard me say this before, so it's not new. I believe that this budget is cruel, and I believe that it is reckless. I believe that it will hurt middle class, working, low-income families that most need our help. In fact, the proposed budget cuts nearly $9 billion from the Department of Education, including the proposed $2 billion Pell Grant rescission. And meanwhile, it proposes a new $5 billion annual tax scheme, which is unregulated, unaccountable, in an effort to fund private school voucher programs. That would undermine our public schools. It would allow an unaccountability and that use of taxpayers' funds. With provisions like that, I really am left with a very serious question for you. How can you support this budget? I mean that genuinely. You're the Secretary of the Department of Education. How can you support and maybe even take pride or boast about taking 10% or more than 12%, if you do count the Pell rescission, away from teachers and away from students? For me, it is beyond the pale. You should know that education is a top priority for everyone on this subcommittee. And today is our third hearing on programs related to the Department of Education. First, we scrutinized the $1.7 billion the subcommittee provides for loan servicing. We heard examples of servicers putting students on the path to default by misinforming them about their repayment options and the department's failures to hold servicers accountable. We heard from the Office of the Inspector General, who cited in their recent audit report about how the Federal Student Aid, FSA, was asleep at the wheel in its oversight of servicers and even relied on the memories of its own employees for tracking recurring noncompliance with federal law. 61% of all monitoring reports showed evidence of servicer failures. FSA has said that it has or will implement all of the IG's recommendations, and yet FSA has yet to fully implement past recommendations from the Government Accountability Office. And while the Next Gen initiative has promise, the department needs to be taking into consideration the compliance of contractors upholding the law, which is not currently the case. In that regard, I find it alarming that within 3 months of your confirmation, you withdrew the Mitchell and King memos, which would have addressed many of the system's current failures. Second, we held an oversight hearing on predatory for-profit colleges. They enroll 9% of all students in post-secondary education, and yet for-profit colleges account for 34% of all student loan defaults. Their business model relies on exploiting federal financial aid, like Pell Grants. These schools target the most vulnerable and our veterans. We heard from a student veteran who was left with a worthless degree and $100,000 in debt after being lured into thinking that Pell and the GI Bill would cover his costs. Meanwhile, the department is working to roll back critical protections for students and taxpayers, specifically the gainful employment and borrower defense rules. And the department is currently working on efforts that could roll back even more. Before we get into the specifics of the Department of Education budget, let me say that the President's budget guiding principle, one that bolsters military spending while sharply cutting funding in education and training, whilst claiming that we simply cannot afford it, is an argument that I wholeheartedly reject, and I am not alone. Earlier this year, more than 300 military leaders wrote to Congress asking for balanced investments in both defense and non-defense spending. They say, and I quote, "Non-defense discretionary programs play a variety of roles in supporting and enhancing our national security by contributing directly to health, education, and development of our youngest generation." They reached this conclusion because 71% of young Americans cannot qualify for military service because they are, and I quote again, "too poorly educated, medically or physically unfit, or have a disqualifying record of crime or drug abuse," end quote. I do appreciate that the President's budget requests new funding for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM programs. The carve-out initiated by this subcommittee in the Education, Innovation, and Research Program. That is a commitment that I share. And while I am pleased that the President's budget request abandons a previous proposal to shift $500 million from neighborhood public schools, where 90% of our children attend, to private schools, I am disappointed that the administration is proposing a new $5 billion a year tax scheme. Data we have strongly suggests that vouchers do not work. An Institute of Education Sciences gold standard evaluation of Washington, D.C., the only federally funded voucher program, found that vouchers negatively impacted student achievement. And I might add that you are also cutting funding for IES by 15%. This is the entity that your own budget documents say, quote, "provides valuable insight into how public dollars could be better used to improve student outcomes." The three education budgets from this administration have proposed the largest cuts to education funding in 4 decades. That's since the department was created in 1979. Madam Secretary, I just have to say, I have to say it. I mean, it may be offensive. Shame on you. This is your watch. You are Secretary of the Department of Education. In your testimony, you talk about freedom. But what is happening here is that you and the President are proposing to abandon middle-class families and those families who are in need. This is not freedom. Yet, I will note the administration is not shy about spending and using government when it comes to benefiting corporations and the richest, such as the $1.5 trillion tax scam and crop insurance subsidies, which can go to the richest of the rich, since there are no eligibility caps. No, the administration only opposes spending when it aids the vulnerable, when it promotes the common good, or when it makes opportunity real for people. Many of these cuts were rejected under a Republican Congress for 2 years. Yet, here they are again. You have eliminated 30 programs totaling $7 billion, and you've cut another $1 billion, eliminating the impact aid payments for federal properties, Special Olympics, after-school grants that help people with disabilities find jobs, eliminating literacy programs that build the foundation for a lifetime of learning, and the main program, Title II, that helps to attract and retain high-quality and diverse leaders while directing scarce education resources to unproven, unaccountable private entities through a new, quote, teacher voucher proposal. Eliminating a temporary fix for rejected borrowers who thought they qualified for public service loan forgiveness, and slashing adult education, federal work study, TRIO, and Gear Up. On the mandatory side, that's outside of this committee's jurisdiction, the budget again proposes to eliminate subsidized student loans and the public service loan forgiveness program, worsening the student debt crisis. In a rare move, the Trump administration's own Department of Defense opposed the House Republicans' Higher Education Act reauthorization bill last Congress because it, too, eliminated PSLF, stating, and I quote, "DOD opposes this legislation because the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program has been an important recruitment and retention tool for the military to compete with the civilian sector. And even a boost to school safety national activities is not what it seems. It seeks to make up for the proposed elimination of $1.2 billion student support and academic enrichment grants, which includes a set-aside for school safety. The SSAE grants support mental health counselors and services, in addition to providing a well-rounded education by providing exposure to music and to the arts. The new proposal, still a poorly designed cut that does nothing to look at the role of guns in school shootings, just like the Federal Commission on School Safety failed to do as well. At this point, let me just say that I also continue to support, I continue to oppose your indefensible silence, which leaves the door open to states using federal dollars to arm teachers versus current law. Congress never contemplated that the SSAE grants would be used for the purchase of firearms. In fact, Congress denounced the presence of firearms in schools in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Section 41025B, which promotes programs that foster, quote, the creation and the maintenance of a school environment free of weapons. And the Congress reiterated our opposition to taxpayer-funded guns in schools in the Stop School Violence Act in 2018 in the omnibus. It explicitly prohibits program funds from being used for the purchase of firearms or firearms training. I fought hard on this issue in last year's funding bill, advocating that we make clear that Congress never contemplated that such flexibility would allow for the purchase of firearms. My proposal was simple: follow current law. But we could not reach consensus, but I will keep up the fight. This year, we are going to have an opportunity to review charter schools with respect to accountability and effectiveness. The OIG has raised some issues that we must examine, including findings that states mismanaged charter school closures and that the department failed to provide adequate guidance or oversight on the issue. We are an appropriations committee, and we have appropriated serious money, more than $400 million last year alone. We need to conduct oversight. The Trump administration would do well to take a page out of the oath that doctors take, their first principle, which is do no harm. And yet, this budget inflicts harm. That is why I raise again, I do not understand how you can support this budget and be the Secretary of Education. This budget underfunds education at every turn, from early childhood education, K-12 education, post-secondary education, through workforce training. Even programs you claim to support are simply programs that you spare. Title I, IDEA, these are core programs. They are level funded. That is not sufficient. We have promised, and we owe our students and teachers more. And I'm not alone in the criticism here. Others, National Center for Learning Disabilities, National Association of Federally Impacted Schools, the School Superintendents Association, Council for the Opportunity in Education, Council for Education Funding, and others. I would hope that this would be of real concern to you as well. I look forward to further discussion of your budget request and the other policy areas that are under your jurisdiction. First, let me turn not the gavel. No, I'm not going to do that.
That's okay.
No, not on my watch. But first, let me turn to my colleague and my friend, the ranking member from Oklahoma, Congressman Cole.
I would thank my friend, the chair, and if you ever want to rethink that offer, that's okay by me. I just want you to know we'd step up and cooperate. But good morning, Madam Secretary. I look forward to hearing your testimony today. As a former educator myself, I understand how important it is for our children to have access to quality education. And as the parent of a teacher who works with kids with special challenges, I understand how important the charge that we've given you is. Without question, education is one of the most important building blocks for success, and access to quality learning directly impacts lifelong development and unlocks each individual's potential. And I commend you for your efforts in this arena, not only as secretary, but as a selfless advocate for reform in the years before you assumed your current position. I was pleased to see that your budget request continues to prioritize resources to certain populations of children who need additional support. I appreciate the continued investment in these programs, such as for children with special needs and disabilities, for Indian education and rural education, and to support English learners. I was also pleased to see your emphasis on charter schools, school safety, and other initiatives that support innovation, best practices, and school choice. And I continue to be a strong supporter of career and technical education, and I'm proud that my home state of Oklahoma is leading the way in innovative models for delivering cutting-edge skills that can lead to good-paying, rewarding careers for students who do not wish to pursue a four-year liberal arts degree. I thank you for your support of those programs as well. Madam Secretary, your budget again proposes to eliminate, consolidate, or change over 24 programs. Many of those proposals make sense in the context of a reauthorization or consolidation, but I do believe others are somewhat short-sighted. I'm particularly concerned about the proposal to move the successful TRIO program from a competitive grant model to a formula grant to states. I'm also concerned about the proposal to consolidate several minority-serving institutions' funding into a single stream. As you know, these institutions serve distinct populations with different needs, and I'm not certain that such a change makes sense. But I look forward to hearing your discussion of it in the course of your testimony. Finally, I think that it may be time, in our country especially, we need more understanding of civics and our shared history. So I was disappointed as an historian to see the American History and Civics Education line proposed for termination. I know that you were faced with a difficult challenge of making all the pieces fit into a tight budget. So I do understand the need for some program terminations and consolidations. However, I caution my fellow subcommittee members that we need to take a hard look at the impact of some of these cuts will have on our own local school districts and students, and I'm sure we'll have a robust this conversation to that point. Since both my friend, the chairman, and the chair, and Madam Secretary, you talked about the budget deficit and the wider budget. I'm going to go off script here for a minute and talk just a little bit about that, because I think this is one where we probably come from different perspectives, but I think the numbers will drive us to similar conclusions. Not widely known or appreciated even in Congress, but as we know, the budget has two big components. It's got a discretionary component, and it's got an entitlement or mandatory spending component. The discretionary component is about 30% of the whole budget. The mandatory part is about 70%. This Congress is actually, if you look, then broke down that 30% into two components. More than half of it is actually the defense budget and overseas contingency operation. Congress is actually spending less money on defense and less money on overseas military operations than it was in fiscal year 2010, in this year of fiscal year 2019. So that suggests, frankly, I actually agree with the President's effort to strengthen defense, and we live in a very dangerous world, but we're not overspending in this area by any stretch of the imagination. I would also remind my colleagues the same thing's true in non-defense. We're actually spending less in all these programs, everything from Meals on Wheels to Head Start to the education programs that you're in charge of, than we were in fiscal year 2010. And when you take into inflation, that means we're spending less. So actually on the discretionary side of the budget, Congress has done a pretty good job of holding spending flat and actually effectively reducing it as a result of inflation. So where's the deficit coming from? Well, it's pretty easy. It's coming from the other side of the budget. Fiscal year 2010, we were spending roughly $1.9 trillion in mandatory programs. This year, it'll be close to $2.6 trillion. Then throw in interest on the national debt, you move from about $190 billion to a little bit over 300, I think about $320 billion. So until we get serious about the non-discretionary side of the budget, we're not going to ever have a balanced budget, and we're going to continue to see as the baby boomer generation retires and lives longer than any previous generation, a massive increase in spending on that side of the budget. Now, it gives me no pleasure to say this, but neither the current president nor the last president addressed this. The last person that tried to do anything about it was actually President Bush, who proposed Social Security reform back in 2005, and it was summarily shut down by a less than courageous Congress on both sides of the aisle, I might say. But we're going to have to revisit those kinds of questions if we're going to actually get there. And I think that's important in the context of the programs that we're discussing today, because much of the pressure that you face and that your fellow cabinet secretaries face is because neither Congress nor the executive branch under both parties has been willing to look at the other side of the budget and do the things that are necessary over there to bring us toward balance. I know that today we'll have a very robust discussion, and we'll come at it from different points of view, and that's okay. I always like to point out to my good friend, the chair, that in the previous 4 years, we started at different points, but 4 years in a row, we ended up voting for the final bill. And in the last 2 years, President Trump signed that bill. So I think we'll probably, come at this from different points of view again. That's okay. That's what the legislative process is supposed to be about. But my goal will be, at the end of the day, to produce a product that my friends and I on both sides of the aisle can vote for, and that the president can sign with a great deal of pride. And I suspect that will call for a certain amount of compromise along the way. That's the way the appropriations process has always worked, and I suspect that's the way it'll work again. And with that, Madam Chairman, I'll yield back my time, but again, I just want to thank the Secretary for being here, and thank you for holding the hearing.
Thank you very much. And now it gives me a pleasure to turn to our distinguished chair of the full committee, Chairwoman Anita Lowy, for any comments that she may have. Mrs. Lowy?
And I, too, want to thank Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member Cole, for holding this hearing, and I want to join them in welcoming you, Secretary DeVos, before the subcommittee. We are not far into appropriations hearing season, but frankly, I am tired of hearing about the administration's so-called tough choices. Secretary DeVos, your budget request does not reflect the reality in classrooms across the country, and if enacted, would cause structural damage to communities across the nation. Since you've taken over as Education Secretary, children continue to be at risk of gun violence in their classrooms. Sexual assault continues to climb on college campuses. Student debt dictates almost every college graduate's professional choices. Yet in your testimony, you criticize a Republican-controlled Congress for increasing your agency's resources. You're criticizing your agency's resources. This budget relies on anecdotal evidence and false concepts that you call choice and freedom. You propose complete elimination of 21st century community learning centers, which would leave more than 87,000 New York students without safe, high-quality after-school enrichment and significant cuts to K-12 funding, and even the Helen Keller National Center for Deaf, Blind Youths and Adults. I'll go on, but I can't help but wonder. We're both parents, and I wonder if you've visited these centers and you know what they're doing. I visit, by the way, the after-school programs all the time, and to see those children getting the extra support, frankly, makes me feel great. I would increase them even more than they are now, so I'm really puzzled about that, among others. While gutting these investments, the administration's budget calls for a new tax credit to support private school vouchers, even though many of these schools are unequipped to accommodate students with disabilities and English language learners. Not only do you ignore racial and socioeconomic disparities in our education system, you propose policies proven to increase the divide. By cutting minority science and engineering improvement by $1.5 million and the Child Care Access Means Parent in School program by 70%, your budget would actually decrease the diversity of STEM fields and exclude parents with financial need from access to a higher education. A couple of words about that. Maybe you noticed recently, I'm a graduate of the Bronx High School of Science, and you noticed there have been many articles about the lack of diversity at Bronx Science or Stuyvesant High School in New York City. I'd be interested in knowing if you have any solution to that. I think people deserve to have the opportunity, and I would look at after-school programs or other concentrations so you can help these students, so you can really say, and when I visit all these schools, I say, you have the opportunity to reach for the stars, but if we're not providing them with this kind of support, it seems to me we are really, frankly, going off on tangents here, there, increasing dollars, but not looking at the investments that are going to help so many of these kids. You propose an increase of $105 million for school safety national activities with the hopes of implementing safety practices that are proven to make schools less safe. The Department of Education's budget request is just another example of this administration's disregard for facts and disconnect from reality. With this budget request, I'm receiving President Trump's message loud and clear. Fund the wall with money from our children's schools. I do hope your testimony and response to our questions will address these deep concerns. And thank you, Madam.
Thank you very much. The Secretary has completed her testimony, which we'll get to in a moment. We will proceed to 5-minute rounds for questions. I will recognize members in order of seniority at the time of gaveling in the hearing. Then I will call on members in order of their appearance. Madam Secretary, we will be happy to place your full testimony into the record. If you would be kind enough to summarize your statement, I want to make sure that we leave enough time for everyone's questions. So please begin when you are ready.
Thank you. Chairwoman DeLauro, Ranking Member Cole, Chairwoman Lowy, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the President's fiscal year 2020 budget. I thought it would be useful to begin by recalling Congress's commitment when it created the U.S. Department of Education 40 years ago. Then, Congress vowed that the move would, quote, not increase the authority of the federal government over education or diminish the responsibility for education, which is reserved to the states, and I'll add communities and parents. This budget reflects a commitment to that sentiment. It also recognizes who actually funds the government's budget, American taxpayers. And so we propose Congress spend their money wisely, efficiently, and with restraint. The President's fiscal year 2020 budget would reduce overall funding for department programs by $7.1 billion, which is a 10% decrease from 2019's appropriated level. This reduction is similar to last year's request and the year before that as well. I acknowledge that you rejected those recommendations. I also acknowledge that it's easier to keep spending, to keep saying yes, and to keep saddling tomorrow's generations with today's growing debt. But as it's been said, the government will run out of other people's money. Over the past 40 years, federal taxpayer spending on education has increased about 180%, amounting to over $1.2 trillion cumulatively. And yet we're still 24th in reading, 25th in science, and 40th in math when compared to the rest of the world. Doing the same thing, and more of it, won't bring about new results. I propose a different approach: freedom. This budget focuses on freedom for teachers, freedom for parents, freedom for all students. A great education shouldn't be determined by where you live or by who you know, and it shouldn't be determined by family income. And education shouldn't be an old-school, industrial-age, one-size-fits-all approach. Every student is unique, and everyone learns differently. Every child should be free to learn where and how it works for them, where and how it unlocks their potential. That's why the President's 2020 budget proposes a historic investment in America's students: education freedom scholarships. Our bold proposal will offer a dollar-for-dollar federal income tax credit for voluntary contributions to 501c3 nonprofit organizations that provide scholarships to school students, not school buildings. These students, their families, teachers, schools, states, can choose to participate in the program, or they can elect not to participate. It's a choice. And since the proposal relies entirely on voluntary contributions to nonprofit organizations, it won't take a single dollar from local public school teachers or public school students. Indeed, our budget maintains current levels of funding for Title I and IDEA. Something else: education freedom scholarships aren't only for students who want to attend private schools. In fact, some states may choose to design scholarships for public school options, such as apprenticeships or transportation to a different public school. States have the opportunity to be really imaginative and to serve the unique needs of their students. We don't have to look far to see that education freedom works. Thanks to a menu of options and the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, embraced by teachers, parents, and students alike, more than half of students in the district attend schools other than their assigned one, and there is still significant unmet demand. We propose Congress double the DC program's funding to $30 million to meet those students' needs. This administration believes students of all ages should be free to pursue multiple pathways to higher education and successful careers. That's why this budget proposes to expand use of Pell Grants for quality short-term programs. It also invests in career and technical education and streamlines student loan repayment. The latter is urgently necessary because today federal student aid holds $1.5 trillion in outstanding loans, more than total auto debt and credit card debt. And 43% of those loans are either in default, more than 30 days delinquent, or are negatively amortized. And taxpayers are on the hook for it all. This budget consolidates numerous repayment plans and raises the cap on a borrower's monthly payment to 12.5% of discretionary income. This is one way the federal government can become a more responsible lender. Policies should not entice students into greater debt, nor should they put taxpayer dollars at greater risk. Education freedom isn't just for parents and students. Teachers need greater freedom as well. We seek to empower America's teachers and elevate their profession via this budget with a new total investment of $370 million. I regularly meet with a number of excellent teachers who tell me they'd like to choose their own professional development and customize it for their needs. To that end, the budget requests an increase of $170 million to focus on development that's controlled by teachers, not dictated by the district office. These are teacher vouchers, and they treat teachers as the professionals they are. Teachers also tell me about the value of mentors or residency opportunities. So we're requesting $200 million to enable new teachers more opportunities to learn from the best. It's also essential that teachers and students be safe at school. In the wake of tragic acts of school violence in our country, President Trump asked me to lead a federal commission on school safety. To support the commission's recommendations, we request $200 million to help communities develop their own school emergency plans and to focus on counseling and healthy behaviors for their students. In the end, budgets are about priorities. Ours are students, parents, teachers, and taxpayers. If our country is to remain secure, strong, prosperous, and free, we need students of all ages who are prepared to pursue successful careers and lead meaningful lives. Thank you for this opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. My view full of cruel cuts to education programs, it baffles me that you found room for a $60 million increase to the charter school program, or CSP, especially when you consider recent reports of waste and abuse in that program. Just this morning, Washington Post published reports that up to $1 billion in CSP funding has been wasted on charter schools that never opened or precipitously closed due to mismanagement. In September, the OIG found that the department did not provide effective oversight of processes performed by the states that receive CSP funding when their charter schools close. In response to the IG's findings, the department stated, and I quote, "The fundamental principle for guiding states' implementation of charter schools is to provide charter schools increased levels of autonomy so they may innovate in exchange for increased flexibility in implementing applicable requirements," end quote. In other words, it sounds like you are saying, quote, "This is not our job." Can you explain how you think stopping known waste, fraud, and abuse in the charter school program is not the department's job? Why cannot states both follow federal laws and promote innovation when it comes to charter schools?
Chairwoman, we're very aware of the issues that this report raised, and it actually covers practices that long predate this administration. The fact Congress took action to address these concerns, and it was prior to the reauthorization of ESEA. We are very keen to ensure that the concerns raised are addressed, and we are also looking to this body for more flexibility for charters to be able to authorize the schools that are working for
Madam Secretary, it would appear to me that based on this report and other reports, that the charter schools have enormous flexibility. And there seems to be no one who is overseeing how that flexibility translates into the use of federal dollars. You are also now proposing this increase of $60 million. We're looking at $500 million for entities that they're just going their way. Let's be flexible. Let's let them do what they want. They don't open, they close, no one concerns about any of the students as well. That's irresponsible in terms of your job with regard to oversight. And as it has to do with federal taxpayers' dollars, that is the charge of this subcommittee, to make sure that those monies are being monitored and that you are accountable and not asleep at the wheel for what is happening with charter schools in this country. We've spent a lot of time and money in this effort. Let me also talk to you about a K-12 education office. Children, families, count on your support to deal with the ESSA. I am disappointed to hear reports about your mismanagement of the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education. 2016, it would appear you merged OESE and the Office of Innovation and Improvement. It had 328 employees. We're down to OESE, having just 260 employees, nearly 21% staff reduction. There are a lot of press reports out there, and I quote, describe long waits for answers to technical questions, harried staffers, lack of overall support, technical know-how, including when it comes to improving schools. Do you see it as your responsibility to help states to implement ESSA? What is your message to states complaining that the lights are off at your Department of Education? I might also add, I believe there was a contract awarded to look at morale in the department. So.
Well, Chairman, let me just comment on your previous question. And I would just say, with regard to charter schools, what we need is more charter schools and more options for children, not less. And states are proving time and again that there are wonderful options that are being developed for children of of every learning type and interest, and we need more of them, not less. And when you have experimentation, you're always going to have schools that don't make it, and that's exactly as what should happen. They should close, and let's also look at how many traditional public schools have closed because they're not doing well for their students. Charter schools are a great option for thousands and thousands of students, and the demand for more of them remains very high. So we need more of them, not fewer. With regard to the department and our organization there, we have undertaken an effort to organize around the ability to be cohesive and effective in the work that we do for all of K-12 schools. And bringing in innovation and ingenuity into elementary and secondary education needs to happen no matter where the education is taking place. I'm very, very proud of the work of the department and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education in the implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act.
Madam Secretary.
They've been doing a great job. We've approved all of the...
Madam Secretary, let me just say that you are taking public dollars to open charter schools, and you're taking money away from our public schools, which is where 90% of our children are.
Madam Chairman,
and what you're doing is
schools are
shortchanging
public
them.
schools.
And I would just say, you know, some of them, if you take a look at the data and the information, we're looking at the transference to private entities, private corporate boards. They open, they close, they don't, some of them don't even open, and we are spending good money after bad, and in addition to that, you don't seem to think that there's a necessity to oversee it, to claim any accountability for it. It's God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. It's not true. We are wasting money there.
And charter
Thank you,
schools are public schools.
My time is
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. If we may, I actually want to pick up on that because I want to ask you a little bit more about it. I'm a big supporter of charter schools, and we've had, working with your office, frankly, substantial increases. So if you would, why don't you report on some of the successes that you've had in this area?
Well, thank you, Chairman, or Ranking Member Cole. Thank you for the question to elaborate a little bit more on the value of charter schools to students today. We are seeing across the country, I think with the exception of 4 states, charter schools have been able to grow up in 46 out of the 50 states. And for students, it has been a wonderful alternative. We know that there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students who want to have an alternative to their assigned public school, and charter schools often provide that opportunity. I have visited all types of schools. And it doesn't really matter how a school is organized to me. What matters is whether the students going to that school find the right fit for themselves and are able to pursue their learning and education in a way that really draws the best out of them. We need to continue to build on that, and that's why this budget proposes an expansion in the commitment of funding to charter schools to continue to support high-quality options for students. Every state has high accountability provisions, varying accountability provisions for their charter schools, and do a good job, I think, of overseeing them at that level. We also do at the Department of Education, but the most important point of accountability are the parents who've chosen to send their child to whatever that charter school is. And we're going to continue to see great results from students who are able to pursue their education in those settings.
Well, I appreciate your work in this regard. I too visit schools pretty frequently, public and charter. I've got great public schools. I've got some great charter schools, and I think you're right about the allowing parents to choose the best path and children to choose to participate in that decision. Let me ask you, one of the things that I was very pleased with in the budget was your proposals in career and technical education. Both, I hear more from employers in my district about the need for folks with skills, and frankly, I meet so many children and young people that this is the way they want to go as opposed to traditional four-year college education. So 2 areas I'd ask you to elaborate on that you proposed. The first is your $20 million STEM competition proposal and how you see that incentivizing and building into career and technical. And second, this idea of using Pell Grants for shorter-term credentialed programs. How would that work? That's actually something I've always been supportive of, but never found a way to finance because I think the demand would be just tremendous. But I'm interested in your proposals in both those areas.
Well, thanks for those questions. Yes, this administration is a huge proponent of supporting alternative pathways to higher education, and career and technical education is a very important piece of that equation, and in fact is an expanding area, I think. I think one of the major hurdles is for us to perceptually, and I say us, speaking as a parent, parents often don't view career and technical opportunities as valid as, because for decades we've been told only four-year college and university is the path to success. Well, we've got to get beyond that because today we have over 7 million jobs going unfilled that require education beyond high school, but not necessarily a four-year degree. So to your question specifically about the $20 million investment in STEM, in STEM occupations and STEM pathways, we know that there are huge opportunities from a career perspective in the areas of math and science, and particularly in computer science. So that also couples with the proposal for short-term Pell. Short-term Pell would allow for high-quality certificate and certification programs to be accessed where today students with receiving Pell Grants cannot access them. And one of the question around funding for them, I think there's a little bit of presumption going on with the math that this would be an additive program. I suspect there are a great many Pell Grant eligible students who would opt to take one of these short-term Pell opportunities in lieu of perhaps a longer-term, more traditional route. And so I think we would see a trade-off for many of those options. And I think we need to take that step, I would argue, because there are so many great opportunities for short-term.
Again, I want to work with you, and I'm out of time, so we'll pursue this another time. But I would be very interested as you go forward, any information you have back on the specifics, or you're going to limit it to certain skill sets or whatever. But again, I think it's a great idea, great place to start. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
On this report, U.S. government wasted up to $1 billion on charter schools and still fails to adequately monitor grants. Now yield to the gentlelady from New York, Mrs. Lowy.
Madam Secretary, your agency recently conducted a report on 21st century community learning centers that concluded half of the students who participated in these after-school activities improved their math and reading grades. More than 68% improved their homework and class participation, and 3 out of 5 improved their classroom behavior. Last year, much to my surprise, you proposed the elimination of these after-school programs. Congress, under a Republican majority, not only rejected the administration's cuts last year, but increased after-school investments by $10 million. This year, I'm puzzled, you're trying to cut it again, completely ignoring the strong evidence that parents support this program and, in fact, want more of it. Could you tell me, why does your budget yet again prioritize cutting this very important program and very popular program, while your own study proves it's successful and Congress has demonstrated its strong bipartisan support for it?
Well, thank you, Chairwoman, for that question. Actually, the data that we have shows very differently, and the funds coming from the federal level do not really show significant impact on the students that it's meant to serve. The dollars flowing out of the federal program are not getting to programs that are working really well on behalf of the students, and there's not great participation rates. In fact, data from 2017 suggests that only 25% of elementary school program participants improved in their reading, and only 19% of middle and high school students improved and made gains in math. The proposal in the budget is we had to make difficult decisions in the budget in our proposals, and remember, they're just proposals to you. But in doing so, we have really focused in on the things that we know are really yielding results and are getting to the students that are most vulnerable and need it most. So our proposal to eliminate 21st century learning funding doesn't speak to the program itself as much as it does to priorities, and also to the fact that the funding that we have been required to make through this 21st century federal level programming does not show the results for the students. Perhaps some of the state and local community level support does, and there's lots of philanthropic support around after-school programs, but the funding from the Department of Education has not shown to be as effective.
Well, I'm not going to get into a debate with you now. I'm glad that you said this is just a proposal, because you could be sure that many of us who serve on this committee and visit these local programs understand how effective and how important they are. So I wish you'd give some more thought to them, and I wonder if you have visited many of them. I've been a supporter of these for a long time, and they're really life-saving for many of these kids in the communities. Another important, in fact, for me, it's been essential in many of our schools. Your budget proposes to roll back significant progress we've made in this subcommittee on a bipartisan basis to increase investments in child care access means parents and schools. It's called C-Campus Initiative. The only federal program that supports child care access on campus for low-income parents working towards a higher education. A year ago today, the president advisor, Ivanka Trump, tweeted out her support for the C-Campus program. Now, I'm not saying that Ivanka Trump is an expert in this, but her father seems to respond favorably to her opinions. Would you say that her tweet on this program signaled the administration's support for C-Campus?
Well, we, again, had to make many difficult decisions in presenting this budget, and we have suggested the elimination or reduction of a number of programs. And we have continued to stay focused on the ones that are really serving the most vulnerable students. Title I funding has been held even. IDEA funding held even. English language learner funding held even. And those are funds that can be used also for children that we're talking about, not in the same way, granted, but definitely flexibility in how these funds are used. And again, we've made choices in this budget and are presenting our proposals to you for consideration.
Well, I have two other questions about this, if I may ask them just quickly. But maybe that's why you shouldn't be proposing a cut in your overall budget, because I wonder if you've seen these programs and see how critical they are to many of our communities. And I wonder, has the Department of Education studied the impact these cuts would have on the 5,000 parents who would lose access to on-campus child care? And I'd like to see the data to predict how this elimination would impact degree completion. My time is up, but I would hope you can respond to me. I've been to these schools. I've worked with these schools. I see the impact. I see the impact on the parents and on their kids, and this is such an invaluable program. I know we're going to reconsider it, and I would hope you would educate yourself about this program as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Congressman Molinar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary DeVos, thank you for being here with us and appreciated your overview. And the work you're doing. A few things I wanted to just comment on. One is you've done a great service today by clarifying that charter schools are public schools. In Michigan law, we call them public school academies. I was a former charter school administrator, and I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that somehow charter schools are not public schools, and I thank you for doing that today. It's something that I've seen tremendous things in Michigan. It's part of Detroit's comeback, some of the charter schools there that are giving parents and their families opportunities in an area where they aren't being served. And so I appreciate your advocacy. I wondered if you would speak a bit more about some of the proposals you have on expanding options for school choice for families. And also, if you would, explain to us who benefits from that. What's the type of student, who really benefits from that?
Well, thank you, Congressman. Appreciate that question very much. The main proposal that this administration is advancing is called Education Freedom Scholarships, and it would create a federal tax credit that capped at $5 billion annually that states could elect to participate in or not. If they did elect to participate, they would create programs or augment programs that they already have existing in their state and would give access to families as they decide. So most programs today that in states are means tested, and most students that today are benefiting from school choice education freedom programs are students that are vulnerable, that have been stuck in schools that aren't working for them. Their families can't move somewhere else like so many others can. They cannot buy a home in the suburbs where a good school is. And so it gives these children opportunities that they haven't had before. And the beauty with the Education Freedom Scholarships proposal and initiative is contributions to it are voluntary. Nobody's coercing anyone to give. Nobody's coercing any state to participate, and nobody's coercing any family to participate in the programs that the states create. What it will do is give a lot of children, hundreds of thousands of children across the country, the opportunity to find an education fit that's going to be right for them.
And you know, one of the concerns that was raised earlier is school violence, threats to student safety, student achievement. I mean, if you're a parent in an area where you don't have a school district that you feel your children are safe or they aren't meeting the needs academically, I would think that this would be a big positive for them.
It would indeed. In fact, I would cite a program that Florida recently enacted called the Hope Scholarships Program for students who are bullied in their assigned school and or are have acts of violence committed against them. They are able to find a school that will work for them through this Hope Scholarships Program. So states could elect to adopt something like this. And Florida could elect to augment the program that they have, but giving parents and students options to find the right educational fit for each child, I think is an imperative.
And then I wanted to also follow up, and Mr. Cole was mentioning some of the ideas around the Pell grants and some of the short-term Pell. One of the things I'm experiencing in my district as I meet with owners of businesses, manufacturers, consistently they're saying we could hire more people. We just need to have people with the right skills. We would, love to have some kind of a certificate training program. In my home area, there's a company that it's a chemical company. They have a fast start program with a community college where it's a intensive short-term program, and then these are very good paying jobs once they get in. Is this kind of what you're looking at for the short-term Pell?
Yes, indeed. And I think it's a great opportunity in communities and regions for employers to work with educators and really come up with proposals that are going to work for the employer's needs, and that will, that educators will be able to come in alongside of them and help create the kind of curriculum that is going to be absolutely perfect for the situation that that particular community or that region needs. And yes, this is exactly what a short-term Pell proposal could help to address.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair, and ranking member for this hearing. Welcome, Madam Secretary. Madam Secretary, you remember Steve Bannon, right? Steve Bannon indicated that the Trump administration's goal was to deconstruct the administrative state. And each cabinet official who comes to this committee presents budget that really reflect that agenda. And your budget reflects what exactly Steve Bannon said: privatizing public education, getting rid of the public sector, turning it over to the corporations and the private sector to ensure the quality public education that our young people deserve, and it's outrageous. Your cuts here specifically target students of color. It's unbelievable, low-income students. And I just have to say, Madam Secretary, you have zeroed out Special Olympics once again. I still can't understand why you would go after disabled children in your budget. You zero that out. It's appalling. I want to ask you a couple of things, which again reflects exactly what I just said. 2 years ago, I wrote into the language into the bill about school desegregation. The language asks for a report from your department in coordination with the Office of Civil Rights to submit to this committee detailing recommendations on how to address the adverse impacts of segregation, including Title VI school monitors, to ensure that every student has the opportunity for an equal education. Madam Secretary, this letter came, we wrote it June 7th. We've called, we've asked for this report, we've tried to reach you over and over again. We've never received a response. I wonder where this report is. Could you let us know when this report will be coming to the committee? It's about students of color, it's about school desegregation efforts.
Congresswoman, yes, I'm aware of that request and that report, and I know it's near completion, and I commit to you that we will get that to you as soon as feasible.
Madam Secretary, this is almost 2 years. We've been waiting. These kids deserve, and the school district deserve, an answer from our Secretary of Education. We can't wait 2 years to get a report on school desegregation from you. It shouldn't be that hard to do. And the response has been awful in terms of trying to get some sense of timing and why this has been delayed. Next, let me ask you about the school disciplinary practices that impact Black and Latino students. According to data released by the Department of Ed's Office of Civil Rights, Black K-12 students and Latino students are 3 times likely to be suspended or expelled as their white peers. But now the Federal Commission on School Safety, which you chair, eliminated the 2014 school discipline guidance, which ensured that students of color are not subject to harsher disciplinary practices than their white peers. The guidance provided valuable resources for districts. It provided continuous, vigorous federal oversight and enforcement of our civil rights laws to make sure that students' civil rights are upheld. 75 civil rights groups wrote to you in January expressing opposition to the rescission of this guidance. Why in the world would you blame, and I understand what the rationale was, blaming school shootings, the tragic gun violence that has taken place throughout the country, on the civil rights protections for students of color? It doesn't make any sense why that was part of this rescission. Can you explain that?
Well, Congresswoman, no child should be treated or disciplined differently based on his or her race or color or national origin. And if and when they are, our Office for Civil Rights will act swiftly, has acted swiftly. Children need to be treated as individuals, not
But they're
as
not being
statistics.
treated as individuals. That's
They
why
are.
we had this order put in place. And you rescinded that.
Again, any student that is treated or disciplined differently because of his or her color or race
Madam
is going
Secretary,
to be, that
the
is
Department
not
of Civil Rights,
acceptable.
your own Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, indicated that students of color are suspended 3 times more than white students. We put into place some requirements that would begin to turn this around. You rescinded those requirements. So what
Again,
message
no
does this send to
student-
school
No
districts?
student should be treated or disciplined differently
But
based
Madam
on their
Secretary, they
race.
are treated differently. They are treated differently.
No, if they are, it's discrimination.
Well, then
The
why
Office
in the
for
world
Civil
would you
Rights and the Office for
rescind
Civil Rights,
the orders that would correct for this?
the letter amounted to quotas. Children are individuals, they're not
Madam
a
Secretary, this
statistic.
didn't involve quotas. This gave direction on how to correct this horrible problem that we have throughout the country. You go to any community of color where you have schools that are trying to, with minimal resources, provide the best education they can, and you will see what is taking place. So this did not amount to quotas. This amounted to providing those tools and guidance to make sure that students' civil rights are protected. And you rescinded that.
Every community needs to be able to handle their classrooms and discipline in the way that works for them. And if
Madam
a
Secretary,
child-
thank God we
if
had
a
Brown
child-
versus Board of Education. The
and
federal
if a
government
child
gave
is
us a
treated
chance to go to
differently
public schools.
because
We
of
needed
his
the
or her
federal
race,
government to
the Office
provide
for
that
Civil Rights
oversight
will
for civil
address it.
rights protections.
Congresswoman Herrera Butler.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here. You know, I have some questions. I am excited to hear your answers. I do appreciate your willingness to come and to share when I feel like, you know, there's a difference between asking a question and being tough and being somewhat, if I was sitting there and I was asked about what my boss's daughter thought about a proposal I was working on, I'd be a little bit annoyed. If I was being asked, how could you possibly be the Secretary of Education by, and then there's a long list, I just feel like I appreciate your willingness to do the job, even though you're being undermined as you sit there in many different instances. Again, vigorous disagreement. I think Chairman Cole shared that he had some disagreements, and I would share some of the disagreements, you know, with my friends on the other side of the aisle, but it's all how you do it, I think. So I appreciate your willingness very much. First piece I wanted to ask about has to do with mental health. Teachers in my area, Southwest Washington, have shared with me that they see mental health, the crisis of mental health, impacting individual students, classrooms, and communities as a whole. And this cuts across wealthy classrooms, you know, urban districts, rural districts, poor and impoverished districts. I mean, this is no respecter of persons, so to speak. And we're seeing a critical need, really, to provide mental and behavioral health support. And I say we, the community. I mean all of us. This is the whole nation here. But as in your role, does the department have any emphasis on supporting schools and providing this support?
Thanks for that question, Congresswoman. Yes, so the School Safety Commission made a number of recommendations, and among them that were specific to the Department of Education really had to do with improving the school climate, social and emotional learning, mental health issues, and one of the proposals in our budget is a new $100 million school safety state grant program that could be used by states and by communities to implement a mental health program that is appropriate for their school, for their community. And we know that this is an issue that is not unique to any one type of community. And we know that the climate of a school is so, so important. And having visited many schools in the past couple of years, you know when you enter the school if they're being intentional about creating a positive school climate. And we think that this is one important way that we can help states really help their local communities meet specific needs specific to their communities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Because I imagine it's going to look differently, a solution. I think about some of my different schools, small, rural, more urban, increasingly suburban. The solutions might look a little different. Seclusion and restraint. I was just reading an article in my area where there are parents talking about having their 6-year-old held down by the neck while the classroom's cleared, and that was the school solution to dealing with some of the behavioral issues. And I know the department announced an initiative on this, particularly when it comes to providing care, education, safety for children with disabilities. Can you tell me a little bit about the initiative?
Yeah. Well, let me just begin by saying that, every student needs to be able to go to school safe themselves, and other students to be safe in their setting as well. And we have initiated an effort to really help school communities know and understand the law with regard to seclusion and restraint, and then to help ensure that they have the tools necessary to be able to carry out the law in a fashion that is in line with what the intent of it is. And we've also launched an investigation, and this is a joint effort between our Office for Civil Rights and our Office of Special Education, and it is to go and look at some areas where the numbers that have been reported just seem a little bit out of line for some reason, and to really go and understand whether these are accurate reports, and if not, to help them know and understand, again, what their obligations are. We think that this is a really important initiative that we've undertaken without having some kind of a mandate being told to do so.
I appreciate that, and I yield back. Thank you.
Congressman Pocan.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chairman and our committee chairman. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much, Secretary, for being here today. I'd like to try to get to 3 or 4 areas, so if we can be concise, I'd really appreciate it. I do want to follow up on something Ms. Lee asked. When she asked about suspensions, you repeated a few times race, religion, national origin. I noticed you never mentioned sexual orientation or gender identity. Do you think it's all right for a school to discriminate based on someone's sexual orientation or gender identity?
We have laws that cover discriminatory efforts, and our Office for Civil Rights has continued to be very diligent in investigating any allegation of discrimination, and will continue to do so.
So is that a yes or is that a no? I'm trying to get a yes or no, I guess, on that.
We follow the law as this
So personally,
body
you don't have an opinion on it?
defined, and
Because you are giving money, so it leads me to the next question. You are giving money to some charter schools that do discriminate, and that report, I'd like to follow up from our chairwoman's question, where $1 billion has been wasted with 1,000 schools going to charter schools. 1 out of every 4 have failed, and I know in your testimony you thought we should have more charter schools, but when you have a 25% failure rate, that'd be like saying if one of your car tires keeps going flat, rather than replacing it, you're going to add more tires to a car. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but my question would be, what are you doing specifically to get that $1 billion back for taxpayers? And you have in this budget a $60 million increase, a 14% increase for this program when we have 1 out of every 4 failing. How can you address those 2 aspects of that?
well, let me just refer again to the fact that the report covered information from a longer
Sure,
period
but my
of time
question, if I can,
ago.
just because I want to get a couple more
And,
subject areas in, please, Madam Secretary.
I will go to the fact again that we need more charter schools, not fewer of them.
Okay, so what are we
And
doing to
need-
get
and we
money
need-
back for taxpayers? Let's try that one first.
We need traditional public schools
Okay,
to
let's
be
go.
held
No,
to the same
I'm sorry, excuse me,
accountability
Madam Secretary,
standards.
just because I'm trying to save time. So what are we doing to get the money back for taxpayers, the $1 billion that got wasted?
I'm not sure that that's the ultimate conclusion, but we'll certainly look into.
Are we doing anything to get the money
We'll
back?
certainly look into that. And
we're not
as a
doing
part of
anything
the
to get the money
context of
back.
that report.
This is interesting how we ask questions. I feel like I'm speaking a different language. I'm sorry. Okay, so then the second part of that is we have an increase, yet we have the failure rate. All right, so let me go to another area, and I want to follow up on the thing Ms. Lee mentioned about the cuts to Special Olympics. Do you know how many kids are going to be affected by that cut, Madam Secretary?
Mr. Pocan, let me just say again, we had to make some
Okay.
difficult decisions with this budget.
Again, this is a question on how
And
many kids, not about the
I don't
budget.
know the number of kids.
It's
I also know that
272,000
I
kids. That's all. Okay, I'll answer it for you. That's okay. No problem. It's
Let me just say that
272,000
I think
kids
Special
that are
Olympics is an
affected.
awesome organization, one that is well supported by the philanthropic sector as well.
Sure. I'll tell you,
And this
reclaiming
is
my
one-
time if I could, Madam Secretary, because there's a couple more parts to this. So also, we have cuts that go in the special education grants to states from $3 million to $2.2 million, a 26% cut. And then also in this budget, you have a $7.5 million cut to the National Technical Institute for the Blind, a $13 million cut for Gallaudet University, a $5 million cut for federal program for print books for blind students. And you recently had a federal judge rule against us on some areas around special education. I have 2 nephews with autism. What is it that we have a problem with children who are in special education? Why are we cutting all of these programs over and over within this budget?
Well, sir, we have continued to retain the funding levels for IDEA and held that level. So in the context of a
I'm sorry, I don't think I
in the
brought up
context-
IDEA. I believe I brought up Special Olympics, special education grants to states, the National Technical Institute for the Blind, Gallaudet University, federal program for printing books. So if you could address those, that's the question. I would
But
really appreciate
I will
it.
address the broader question around.
Or if you could
supporting
actually address the
students with
question I
special-
asked. That's even a better way to answer a question.
Supporting students with special needs, we have continued to hold that funding level, that funding at a level amount, and in the context of a budget proposal that is a 10% reduction.
All right, I'll reclaim my time. I'll reclaim my time. You're not going to answer the question. Let me try one last one. Maybe I'll get it. Maybe I'll do better than charter schools if I get this one covered by you. You've got a cut to the department that's a 12% agency cut, but you have a 15.6% increase in your executive salary appropriation. How can you justify that?
So the department funding includes a building modernization piece.
Yeah, I didn't ask about buildings.
Well, it's all part of that. It's all part of that budget.
So you're okay with a 12% agency cut in light of a 15.6% increase in executive salary? And by the way, I know it doesn't come out of this budget, but $7 million security expense in the last year.
So we are also funding the Next Gen initiative through federal student aid, which requires a lot of investment now to save in the longer term. Same thing for the building modernization piece. We are in the process of shrinking down the footprint here from 3 buildings to 2. And all of that, the expenditures come up front so that the savings can be realized in the longer term.
Yeah, Madam Chairwoman, I'm sorry I wasn't more clear in my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Harris.
Thank you very much, and good to see you again, Madam Secretary. Let me just, and again, I kind of asked the secretaries when they come before here to explain the President's budget. Now, you have to work within the current statute, right? And the current statute, we have to revert to the old caps. Is that correct?
That is my understanding. Congressman, yes, that's my understanding.
Yeah, Congress hasn't raised the caps, so actually, why anyone up here on this side of this, this wall here would think that the blame is not on us for not having given you the money to spend more. I mean, the bottom line is Congress is failing again. I mean, that's the bottom line. Look, I trust states and localities on education. Look, there's a basic philosophy that, and look, we're people on this side of the wall. Some of us are going to agree to disagree. That some people think the federal government knows best how to educate people in Somerset County. I have one of the 2 poorest counties in the state, and I like to think that my Board of Education and my local county and my state knows how to educate those students. And someone up here, hate to say it, you're part of the federal government, but hate to say it, I don't think the federal government knows best how to educate those students. So I agree with you. The turning over more things to the states, I think, is good. I also think that freedom is an American principle. I think freedom and choice are our principles, and I think that charter schools embody that principle to a large extent. So I think that it was a great idea to highlight charter schools in your budget, and especially the state facilities incentive grants, because it always bothered me. I used to sit on the Education Committee in the state Senate in Maryland. It used to bother me that we'd talk about charter schools, and they would say, we'll give you money for the education, but we're not going to give you any money for a facility. Well, it's kind of hard to educate without a facility, but I guess that's the way the education establishment discourages charter schools. That's the way they do it, and good for you to point that out. Now, you testified that, and you're going to have to explain, give me these numbers again, the reading, science, and math, where we stand in the nation, and I'm sorry, in the world. Was it 24th in reading, 25th in science, 40th in math, or did I get one of those numbers wrong?
No, 24th in reading, 25th in science, and 40th in math.
40th in math. So this is after 40 years of federal involvement. And where did we stand in 1979 before the federal government went in to help the states educate Americans? If you could get back to me, if you could look that up, I'll bet you it wasn't.
Yes, I know we were much higher in the ranking, and we've definitely continued to deteriorate.
Right. So let's just step back and take the big picture. So 1979, we were better. Federal government says, so, it's the words of Ronald Reagan, the 9 most dangerous words, however many words it is, I'm here from the federal government, I'm here to help. So the federal government came in to help education, and now we're much worse off. Well, Madam Secretary, I want to thank you for thinking outside the box and how to reverse some of that. And I do think some of the principles you have elucidated in the budget get to that. I do want to commend you, actually, because I've gone and spoken to teachers and parents in my district who worried a lot about the disparate impact policies of the previous administration, worried a lot about that effect on school discipline, and we're very grateful that this administration took a new look at those disparate impact policies. But I'd like you to expand a little bit, because I do think that one thing the federal government can do is expand the ability of states to be forward-thinking in how they provide alternative education for parents and students who choose not to be in a conventional public school, and explain the new approach you're going to take to encourage states to have these foundations that fund alternatives for parents.
Well, thanks, Congressman, for those comments and the question. This administration continues to support alternative pathways and acknowledges that more and more students are not traditional students, and we are going to have regular interface with education and learning throughout our adult lives, particularly children born today. When you think about the fact that a kindergartner today can look forward to entering a workforce where 85% of the jobs don't yet exist. So we have to be supporting lifelong learning in a way that is meaningful. That goes to some of the recommendations that we made around the Pell, a short-term Pell program, around expanding career and technical education opportunities, pre-apprenticeship opportunities. So there's a proposal in the budget for $60 million to go to pre-apprenticeship programs that will help prepare students to explore these alternative pathways and give them a chance to earn while they are learning. We have a long way to go to really support all of these different alternatives in a meaningful way when you compare it to how we have really weighted every equation around traditional higher education, and we're proposing some small steps in that direction.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Secretary. I yield back.
Congresswoman Frankel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Madam Secretary. You have a very nice disposition, even though I don't agree with some of these budget cuts. But thank you so much for being here. I'm going to try to find some things we can agree about, okay? So let me just start. I want to talk about sexual assault on college campuses. The Department of Justice and CDC has repeatedly documented that roughly 20 to 25% of women have been sexually assaulted, most commonly by men, and I think also men at maybe about a 16% rate or something smaller than that, but that women of college age are at the highest risk. So first of all, I want to ask you this. I'm assuming that you agree that Title IX schools are required to respond to acts of sexual violence that impact students' access to education. Would you agree with that?
I would, Congresswoman, but let me just say that I've said before, and I want to emphasize again, that one act of sexual violence is one too many, and one student that does not have due process is one too many.
Okay, well,
And you know that we are.
let me just, if you could, just to reclaim my time, and we have time, you could talk about the perpetrators and so forth. But do you agree that in practice, many schools are failing to protect victims or hold perpetrators accountable?
What I know is I've heard from students and I've heard from institutional representatives that the framework that they've had to operate under has not worked for too many students, which is precisely why we are in the process of negotiated rulemaking.
Okay, well, let me just, excuse me, I want to find some things we can agree on, and then we can disagree. I am assuming you would agree that people who are subjected to sexual assaults experience terror, helplessness, profound humiliation, and that sexual assaults are among the most harmful, traumatic experiences. Can we at least agree on that point?
Certainly.
Okay, that's great. And I think we can all agree that the response of the survivors community is very important for their recovery. We could agree with that. All right, that's good. Okay, see, I know we're on a good path here. And I think we would also agree that authority figures in schools are in a position of great social authority to help a recovery. All right, we're doing well. Now, so I want to assume for a moment that this is a classroom and that we are meeting on a regular basis. All right, just take a look around. You saw the people who are here. So let's assume, I'm not going to pick any person out, that one of the people in here, could be a man or a woman, has been sexually assaulted by another one that's in the room. This is a classroom. Would you agree that a victim of sexual assault should not be required to sit in a classroom with a perpetrator day after day? Can't we agree with that?
I would agree with that, but let me just say.
No, let's keep
I
going.
appreciate
wait a minute.
and respect your desire to go down this path.
I'm reclaiming my time to ask the next question because we're doing well. I mean, come on, we're agreeing. All right. Now, here's my next question. If let's say I'll say a woman or a man is sexually assaulted at a fraternity house, should that by another classmate, should the victim be required to sit in the classroom with the perpetrator of the sexual assault?
Congresswoman, I appreciate and respect your desire to continue down this path of questioning, but you know that we are in the middle of the rulemaking on this issue.
Could you just answer my question?
It would be inappropriate for me to continue to comment and answer the questions in the way that you're posing.
But here's what I think. I think you agree with me that an assailant shouldn't be allowed to sit next to a victim. And so since I'm running out of time, I guess I have to get to my final question, which maybe we don't agree on. But you have proposed changes that if a student is sexually assaulted by a classmate an off-campus frat, the school is not going to be liable to investigate. And I don't really understand that. If the frat is on the campus or the frat is across the street, it seems to me that the potential harm to the victim is the same. And what that means is, for that victim, all that trauma, all that humiliation, is the likelihood that that victim may not go to class, may drop out of school, and it seems to me the university or the college will be subjecting themselves to a violation of Title IX. Think about it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I yield back.
Congresswoman Bustos.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary DeVos, for joining us today. What I'd like to talk about is the borrower defense rule, if we could, please. After losing your latest court battle to implement the borrower's defense rule, your department issued guidance that no school could force a student into mandatory arbitration over a dispute involving federal student loans. I think that's good. Yet your guidance stresses that schools could continue to use mandatory arbitration as long as the dispute did not involve a federal student loan. Is that correct? I think that's correct. These enrollment contracts where schools hide these mandatory arbitration clauses in fine print, which is standard, students have to enter these contracts in order to attend school. They don't have a choice. So I'm wondering, Madam Secretary, why you would continue to encourage schools to take away students' rights as a condition of going to school.
Well, Congresswoman, let me just speak broadly on the question and the issue. We did not agree with the Obama administration's approach to this. I'm certainly very aware of the court decision, and we are in the process of implementing that, while at the same time we're continuing to work on revising the rules so that it is one that we think is more fair to both students and taxpayers, ultimately. Our partial relief formula is meant to be respectful of taxpayers. There is no student that should be able to make a claim for borrower defense if they have not truly been defrauded or if they are gainfully employed. And so we're going to continue to work on this rule and implement as per the judge's orders.
So I'm wondering if you can talk about what efforts your department is taking to ensure that schools, not including arbitration clauses related to the student loans as part of their enrollment. If you can, is your staff monitoring compliance?
We are following the judge's decision and implementing, and at the same time continuing to work on revising the rule. So that process continues to be ongoing.
Okay, and so I'm going to drill down just a little bit farther. Have you asked accreditors to ensure that schools are in compliance?
We are following the 2016 rule and at the same time continuing to work on revising the rule.
Okay. So you're rewriting the rules, is that correct?
We are.
Okay. So will your rewrite include the existing ban of forced arbitration for federal student loan disputes?
That's all part of the consideration, and it would be premature to actually comment on the rule before it's actually released for comment.
What's your timeline on this?
It's very soon, within the next few months.
All right. Would you, I probably can predict your answer on this, but would you be able to commit to act in the best interest of students and uphold the ban on forced arbitration?
Well, I commit to acting in the best interest of students. I do that every day in my job, and will continue to commit to working on this rule so that it is one that we can be very supportive of and that is equally fair to students and to taxpayers.
Okay. Since I got a minute left, I'm going to address teacher shortage. So I'm from the state of Illinois, and we've got a severe teacher shortage issue. About 1,000 positions that can't be filled. Number one, it's in Chicago, which is outside my congressional district, but the other two are in the cities of Peoria and Rockford, which are in my congressional district. So this is an issue. I've done roundtables on this and have learned from teachers that they feel undervalued, they feel underpaid, they feel overworked. Your budget cuts a critical Department of Education program that school districts can use to improve teacher recruitment and retention. And I know that you've stated that you consider teacher hiring a local issue. But you've also stated that you wanted to help facilitate the sharing of best practices to bring more teachers into schools. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on some of the best practices and share your next steps to help the states and districts with teacher shortages. I'll just leave it at that since we just have a few seconds left here.
Thanks, Congresswoman. I, too, have met with and talked with many teachers and know that way too many of them do feel undervalued and underappreciated. That's why our budget has proposed to really give teachers an opportunity to develop themselves in a way that works for them through a teacher voucher that they can use for their own professional development. One of the things I've heard consistently is that they have been basically told what development to take, when and where, whether it's relevant to their particular subject area or their particular development need. And so we think that this is a really good way to begin to get at that and to show the kind of honor and respect that they should have and to elevate their profession. We also think that through the investment in mentorship and residency opportunities, that teachers will, really great teachers will find a way to continue to develop their own career path and not have to leave the classroom, as too many of them have to do today in order to continue to develop their own career path. They go into administration, and then they're no longer in the classroom. And it doesn't need to be an either-or like that. It can be a both-and. They can continue to be in the classroom and develop a career path if they have the opportunity to teach, as teachers, to teach the teachers. And the mentorship and residency program will allow that kind of opportunity to develop well.
I'll yield back. Thank you.
Congresswoman Watson-Coleman.
Madam Secretary, for being here. Number one, I want to follow up on a question that Congresswoman Lee asked. Specifically, what is your rationale for having rolled back the guidance on dealing with discrimination and civil rights issues in the schools? You mentioned something about quotas. I read the rule has nothing to do with quotas. What is your rationale for having taken that, that guidance and repealed it?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for that question again. I will repeat again that I think we share the same goal, that every student is treated as the individual that they are.
I just want to reclaim my time here because I only want to understand one thing. What is the rationale for repealing a guidance with regard to how you address discrimination, disparate impact, and all of those things on in a school environment?
Well, discrimination is wrong, and it will be pursued.
Well, we agree with that. So
Indeed.
Just tell me, if you don't mind, why you felt it was okay to eliminate a guidance that was to help understand how to process these things. How is that helpful?
Well, actually, the guidance we heard from many, many different quarters that the guidance was actually harming schools and individuals' opportunities to
Thank you, reclaiming my time. I almost want to ask you that every time you talk about, every time you talk about your findings, your research, or whatever, I would love to see that research. I honest to God would love to see what you rely upon as you are answering some of these questions about what to do. Let me tell you something I really support very much in your budget, and that is to expand access to Pell Grants for apprenticeship programs, technical programs. I agree with you. The route is not always a four-year college education. I want to know that in advance of doing that, since that is an innovation on your part, what are you going to have in place to ensure that something like a Trump University that had absolutely no academic relevance is not an organization that benefits from this new approach?
Well, Congresswoman, this proposal is one that we would like to work with Congress to ensure the appropriate boundaries or guardrails are put into place.
Okay. Thank you.
But I think it is an important opportunity.
Yeah, I think that Congress very much would want to know what your parameters were and what your accountability system is going to look like. I want to ask you a question. I've got a lot of questions, and I'm going to probably get to them in a second round, because I have a question with regard to your department's decision not to any longer work with state officials over the redress of victims of for-profit colleges. And this particular question was prompted by a letter that my Attorney General in the state of New Jersey sent to your department several months ago, asking why suddenly you are not collaborating with them and sharing information with them so that they could address the eligibility of students who went to schools like the Corinthian schools that failed them in any way, shape, or form, and that whose loans could be forgiven. A, I'd like to know why you haven't answered that letter yet. And B, I'd like to know, what are you all doing about recapturing that money and protecting those students and informing them that they are eligible to have their loans set aside?
Well, Congresswoman, I certainly want to make sure that we answer your inquiries and requests thoroughly and promptly. And if you could just submit a specific question for the record on what this particular matter is, we will be happy to.
I would really have no problem sending it to you. I simply want you to know that the question that this is prompted by is a letter dated May 17 to you by our Attorney General, Gubrier Graywall. And so I would appreciate an answer. I'll send you the letter again. I would appreciate an answer in a more timely fashion, and he hasn't gotten one. I guess I have to yield back now. I have a second round worth of questions.
Thanks, the gentlelady. Congresswoman Roybal Allard.
Welcome, Madam Secretary. Before I ask my first question, I want to go back to the issue that was raised by Congressman Pocan regarding the waste of $1 billion on charter schools that never opened or opened and then closed. And just suggest that if your department were to do due diligence, and not only in terms of oversight, but in working to reclaim that $1 billion, programs such as the Special Olympics, there would be no need or excuse for eliminating that and other important programs for our children. Metro, I want to talk about the Pell Grants. I agree with your proposal to support career and technical education, but disagree on how you're going about it. As you know, the Pell Grant is the cornerstone of our national commitment to make higher education accessible and affordable. But the purchasing power of Pell Grants has significantly dropped over the years, covering only about 30% of the cost of college today. Your budget flat funds Pell Grants and does not take into account rising inflation costs to education. And in addition, you propose to expand the pool of eligible applicants by opening Pell Grants to short-term programs. How do you hope to finance the additional demands on the program, given that you provide no additional funds for the likely increase in Pell Grants?
Well, Congresswoman, thanks for the question. The proposal for short-term Pell, Congress may well decide to expand the Pell funding. Our proposal is to continue to hold Pell level, but acknowledging that many students that might opt to take a short-term certification program may do so in lieu of a more traditional, longer-term program, which in fact could probably be less costly to both the students and ultimately the taxpayer. But we are looking forward and happy to work with you to set up those kinds of parameters and would welcome the opportunity.
Okay, well, I would suggest that you are not going to get enough students to switch from whatever profession they're seeking that needs a 4-year degree to take these shorter terms. So I'm hoping that, and I'm sure that our chair, we will be, in fact, putting more money into the Pell Grant program. Sorry, I missed this. 1 second, I'm being. I'm just going to move on to my next question. For the third year in a row, your budget proposal has called for complete elimination of the Title IV-A program, stating that it is duplicative and ineffective. This is the same program that your department repeatedly touts as offering local control and flexibility to districts, and even goes so far as to suggest using these program funds to improve social, emotional learning, school climate, and student safety as recommended in the report from the Federal Commission on School Safety that you co-chaired. So why are you ignoring your report's own recommendation and calling for the elimination of a program that for thousands of districts across the country is the only flexible funding available for things like music, PE, STEM, mental health services, school counseling, and violence prevention?
Thanks for that question, Congresswoman. We've proposed this particular program elimination because it has been very thinly spread and has not been shown to be particularly effective at any particular thing. But with regard to school safety initiatives, the administration's budget proposal broadly between the four departments that are touched by school safety issues is proposing $700 million specifically around to support recommendations from the School Safety Commission report. And the Department of Ed's budget includes $200 million, $100 million of which would be for supporting mental health and social emotional learning initiatives at the school level, at the local level, and the balance of it for helping schools to do emergency planning and assessments and take proactive steps to really prevent any acts of violence.
So you're actually disagreeing with your own department's recommendation and the commission that you co-chaired?
No, not at all. In fact, we think that the proposal of the budget really helps get after some of the things that the Commission's report recommended and helps support those initiatives.
In your testimony, you stated the following, and I quote, "Students may be better served by being in larger classes if by hiring fewer teachers, a district or state can better compensate those who have demonstrated high quality and outstanding results." End of quote. This is contrary to decades of longstanding credible research like the student-teacher achievement ratio that actually recommended on average student-teacher ratio to be 15:1. So what evidence-based research do you have to back your statement?
Well, that must be in my written testimony, and I would just comment to the fact that given education freedom initiatives, there are different kinds of environments in which students learn well. Some students can learn better with larger classes, with more students to collaborate with, to learn with, and others in smaller.
Can you just cite what research you're using to make that?
There's plenty of research that will undergird the fact that mandating a specific class size doesn't yield results. I would be happy to have, if you submit a question for the record, I will be happy to do so.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. I want to go back to the school safety report. Within one section of that school safety report, your commission did recommend, we've discussed it earlier, rescinding the 2014 guidance entitled Rethink School Discipline Guidance. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you, as Secretary of Education, you went ahead and rescinded that in January of 2019. Is that correct?
That timing might be about right. It might be a little bit.
But you did rescind it in your official capacity. Is that right?
Yes.
And your words, the guidance was, quote, well-meaning to address the fact that black boys are 3 times more likely to be suspended and black girls are 6 times as likely to be suspended. But the report goes on to say, although well-meaning, you believe, the commission believes, headed by you, that the guidance resulted in teachers and schools not really carrying out discipline because they were afraid of federal action. Is that correct?
That has been Yes, that has been actually spoken to me from a number of teachers.
Okay, and then you went on to lay out in the report that although not specifically called for in the guidance, that there was a concern that the commission had that this guidance was creating quotas or certainly pressure to have quotas, meaning that you would look and have to discipline white students at the same rates you were disciplining black students, however unfairly. Is that what you mean by quotas? That you would actually look and discipline white students to make sure it was equal with the discipline of black students?
Well, Congresswoman, if what you're asking is about whether students can or should be treated differently
I'm
for
asking
the same infraction,
that is what you wrote in your report, that this was a concern that schools would feel pressure to have discipline quotas. That was in your report, right?
Yeah, every student is an individual and
Yep,
needs to be
but
treated
I'm
as
just asking,
such.
quotas was a concern. Is that correct?
Well, that has been suggested by the discipline guidance.
Right,
yes.
and you put it in your report, that was a concern. You also questioned the legal validity of the guidance on a theory of disparate impact. And here's where my questions for you come in. At the base of all of this, you wrote in your report, the racial gap in suspensions, you cite a study and say, quote, the racial gap in suspensions was completely accounted for by a measure of the prior problem behavior of the student, a finding never before reported in literature. Quote from your report, this research undermines the core proposition in disparate impact theory that statistical disparities necessarily demonstrate that classroom teachers and administrators are motivated by race when disciplining students. That's a quote from your report. So I looked at the underlying research, and here's what it shows. It says, and I am quoting from the report, prior problem behavior accounts for the racial gap in school suspensions that you cite in your School Safety Commission report. This report says, studies suggest that school disciplinary rates may reflect the problematic behaviors of Black youth, problem behaviors that are imported into schools and into classrooms. They go on to say, difference in rates of suspensions between racial groups appear to be a function of differences in problem behaviors that emerge early in life, remain relatively stable over time, and then materialize in the classroom. And this report that you've cited and based as your theory concludes by saying the association between school suspensions and blacks and whites reflects long-standing behavioral differences between youth. That's the research that you have cited in your report in concluding that apparently that it is not racial discrimination in discipline, but there are some characteristics of Black children that from this report start very early in life, well before they get to the classroom. And in fact, the author of this report has many other writings where he says it's a liberal fantasy that poverty and racism play into high rates of incarceration and criminal behavior. So my question for you is, when you talk about children shall be treated individually, what are you saying? Are you saying here, when you quote this research, that the problem really is that Black children are just more of a discipline problem? Because that's the research you've quoted in your report.
Well, Congresswoman, I've said it before and I'll say it again. No student, no child should be treated or disciplined differently based on their skin color, their race,
and I think
or their national origin.
Your report agrees with that. They just say that by the very basis of being a Black child, you are more likely to be a discipline problem. That's what the study says that you quoted in your report and said That's why we now think they may not be motivated by race. Black children are just plain old more disruptive in the classroom. How did you come to that conclusion?
Children should never, ever be discriminated against.
Well, I hope you take those
And
words
if
to
they
heart
are treated
and
differently
repeal
or
your
disciplined
citing
differently.
of this research.
Congressman Graves.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam Secretary. Good to see you. First, let me just thank you for your many years of commitment to children's education. Your personal heart and your spirit that you've shown is amazing, and I want to thank you for that. I know that's just been a driving commitment of yourself and your family for many years. And thank you for taking it to the public sector. Not an easy place to go, but you were willing to do that and didn't have to, but you stepped up, and thank you. Just sort of changing direction a little bit, and I know you have plans for the agency in days ahead, and we're talking budgets and such as that, but I know you briefly talked a little bit about the, I guess it's the Educational Freedom Scholarship Program, and maybe you could just go a little deeper in that, because I think that really gets to the heart of what you're trying to do in this department, and that's to make sure that children have access to education that touches them where they are in life as best as it can, and take them to another place that betters them and their family in the future. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I have familiarity in some ways with Georgia has a educational tax credit. Is it similar to that, and how does that work, and how will children benefit from this?
Well, thanks, Congressman, for that question. And to just elaborate a little bit more on what an Education Freedom Scholarship tax credit could mean, we're talking about a federal tax credit that states could elect to participate in or not. So Georgia could decide to participate in that federal pool of tax credit funds and implement a different program than what they already have. They could augment the one that they already have, the tax credit scholarship program there, and really think very creatively about how to address the unique needs of students in Georgia. And, just thinking about some of the lines of questioning here today, and some of the students that I've met that have benefited from being able to have school choice and take advantage of opportunity like that. I think about Denisha Merriweather, a young woman who she failed the third grade twice. She grew up in the Jacksonville, Florida area, failed third grade twice, constantly got into fights at school, had a mom who was not able to really be a full mom for her. Thankfully, she had a godmother who came and found this tax credit scholarship, Florida tax credit scholarship opportunity. And Denisha will tell you today, she wasn't in that school, that faith-based school that her godmom found for her, not even 2 weeks, and she was on a completely different trajectory. She became the first in her family to graduate high school. She's earned a college degree and a master's degree. And she's now working with us at the Department of Education to continue to talk about advancing these opportunities for kids. And I think about so many students today who are stuck in schools that just aren't working for them. And to give them the kind of freedom and opportunity that the Education Freedom Scholarships tax credit would allow is really inspiring to me. And I would hope that those whose minds are closed to that opportunity today would allow them to be open a little bit and just talk to a couple of these students who've been able to make those choices and to find the right place for them. And every child should have those kinds of opportunities.
Thank you for your willingness to propose that, because that's a bold proposal, and I know there's always criticism and objection oftentimes to new concepts, but it does work. And I don't know of an example where a student has gotten a worse education as a result of taking an opportunity such as this. And in fact, some cases, and my wife's a school teacher, in pre-K, so I come from that background too. But unfortunately, it's not the fault of a student. In fact, sometimes they're just tethered to a mailbox. They go to school based on where their mailbox is, and not based on what's best for them and their family and their spot or their needs in essence. So thank you for your willingness to do that. And as we go through, I know we may have more questions. I'd like to take it all the way to the full spectrum of college and how we can better prepare students with understanding the true cost of college. You know, what is the cost benefit of going to a school versus what the degree might deliver on an income base, and how can we better assist students in making college decisions based on facts and finances and true costs. So when we come back around, I'd like to touch on that a little bit. But thank you again.
Thanks, Congressman, and please thank your wife for the great work she does.
Thank you. We are going to embark on a second round, but the time limit will be three minutes for each of us. Okay, thank you. The Department of Education requires a letter of credit from an institution if it determines a serious risk to taxpayers. This includes things like the risk of a precipitous school closure. A couple of questions. Did the Department of Education give back part of the Art Institute of Pittsburgh's, a for-profit college, letter of credit so that it could continue to operate? This was $2 million. This is yes or no?
Well, Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with that specific issue with that specific school. More broadly, yes, we do hold letters of credit.
Well, apparently there was a $2 million give back to the school, which you should check on. Given that the Art Institute of Pittsburgh recently announced it's going to close anyway at the end of this month, March 31st, it's going to close. I need an answer to the question, why did the department do this, and what happened to the money? You appear not to know anything about this, but I would ask you to please check on it and get us an answer quickly as to why it was done and where is the money? Where is the monay?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'd be happy to.
We have testimony from the department's Assistant Inspector General for audit. This is about federal student aid's mismanagement of student loan servicers. I also find it interesting that all of your commentary, even some of the folks on the other side of the aisle, it's about state and localities that ought to have the jurisdiction to go after, to take on education. It's where it belongs, except when it comes to protecting our kids and our borrowers. Then we don't want to look at the state, what they're doing, and the loan servicers. We want federal law to preempt it. That being said, in particular, we've heard evidence of how the department fails to consider a servicer's noncompliance with federal law and past performance. Were not these ideas included in the Mitchell and King memos, which you rescinded following your first 3 months as Secretary of Education?
Well, Congresswoman, we have, as you know, embarked on Next Gen.
I understand it. I know about
Yes,
Next Gen.
and
And I do. I know a lot about it.
If you would allow me to just talk about that a moment, because
no, what I want to know is why. No, my question is, why were the Mitchell and King memos, which were specifically laid out to address a servicer's noncompliance with federal law and past performance? I asked the question. You rescinded the requirement that stated servicing contractors should comply with federal and state law, taking any necessary steps to support oversight by federal or state agencies, regulators, or law enforcement officials. Did you rescind that?
Congresswoman, first of all, let me just say that we take loan servicing and the requirements thereof very seriously. We're continuing to enforce.
Time is up. You do not. Loan services are getting away with putting at grave risk our students.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I only have a short time, so I want to get two things on the record, then ask you a question. Because one, I agree with you on, one I don't. I really want to thank you for this Freedom Scholarship Initiative. I think that's a really important thing, and I agree very much for the idea of injecting choice and freedom into the system and giving both students and, frankly, donors the kind of flexibility I think would help the system and allow us to meet individual needs. I do want to go on record, and you and I have had this discussion before. I disagree on TRIO. I certainly disagree with the elimination of Gear Up. TRIO's produced like 5 million college graduates for the United States, and these are young people that usually come from, not so young sometimes, come from backgrounds that they may not have been able to make it. I know in my state, these are two really important programs. I have this discussion frequently with our Chancellor of Higher Education, with college presidents. They think that this has really helped a student population that we have a lot of, which is a lot of first-generation ones. One thing I do want to ask you about, though, that I was pretty excited about, you've got, and this sort of works with, the President's proposed an apprenticeship program. You have a pre-apprenticeship program, and $60 million new dollars for that. Can you tell me what the difference is, how you would define a pre-apprenticeship program and versus an apprenticeship, how that would work out?
So a pre-apprenticeship, first, thanks, Mr. Cole. Let me just comment on the TRIO thing.
Sure.
One moment, because I know while we have proposed combining Gear Up and TRIO into one program and then a lesser amount for the TRIO program, what we've also proposed is consolidating that into a state formula grant so that states have the opportunity to get some of these funds to institutions and to individuals that are more needy around this. What we've found is that 95% of the competitive grants go to the same places and the same programs time after time, and they don't necessarily help the students that are most in need. So I'd love to talk with you more about that. But
we can have that dialogue another time. But
yes, but with regard to the pre-apprenticeship program, so this proposal is to really start establishing apprenticeship programs that are outside of the registered, more traditional sorts of apprenticeships that trade, the building and trades apprenticeship programs, that this will allow us to allow employers and educators to work together on apprenticeship tracks and opportunities that are going to have a more expansive appeal and more relevance to the market today.
Well, again, this has a lot of appeal to me. I just want to get a little clarity as we go forward over what the definition would be, so we don't end up basically funding the same thing twice.
Well, and we'd love to work with you on that to make sure that's very well.
My career tech people are very excited about all these kind of proposals. Thank you, Madam Chair. Yield back.
Congresswoman Lowy.
Thank you again, Madam Secretary. Quick question before I turn to my question with 3 minutes. Looking at these numbers again, the total cut to the Department of Education compared to FY19 is $8.8 billion, 12.5%. I'm just curious, you could say yes, no, whatever. Did you have any input? Did Mr. Mulvaney or President Trump ask you if you thought those cuts should be made or should be rescinded? Did you have any input?
Congresswoman, yes, this was an ongoing discussion, but let me just correct you in your numbers. The proposed cuts are $7.1 billion. I think you are also rolling in the rescission around Pell, and that is not a cut.
Pretty important, don't you think?
That is not a cut to any existing programs. It's actually it's the Pell surplus. So it's the amount that continues to accrue because not enough students are taking advantage of the Pell program, so the account accrues, and it's just essentially an accounting adjustment to rescind part of that.
Madam Secretary, the hour is late, I'm not going to get into that. I just wondered if you had any input, knowing your commitment to education, you accepted this petition as Secretary of Education. Does Mulvaney say this is yours and this is yours? But let's go on.
This is a process, but let me just also say that it's only at the federal government in Washington that we judge the quality and effectiveness of something by the amount of money we spend on it. And I think we have to get past that notion. Quality and effectiveness does not equate directly to dollars spent.
We can have a longer discussion, but in many of my schools, whether they're getting a Pell Grant or not does depend not just on this specific criteria, but whether there's enough money in the bank to pay for their Pell Grant or pay for their scholarship or help them get through a job and education at the same time. But I'm not going to get into that again. I hope we can continue that discussion. What I wanted to ask you, in the past it's the past week alone, 2 Parkland school shooting survivors, the father of a Sandy Hook victim, died by suicide. this came from the gun violence at schools and highlight the critical importance of mental health support in schools. And while your budget requests an increase for school safety and national activities, it proposes the elimination for the third year in a row of the $1.7 billion Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grant Program. And in my judgment, interacting with educators, you need programs like this and other important interventions that help keep communities safe. Can you just tell us, how is the Education Department responding to this? Has there been any outreach? Has there been any support services? And I have 7 seconds left. So maybe you can just answer it very quickly.
Well, let me just say, I was heartbroken to hear about the students at Parkland, and we are certainly have been in continual contact with them around the immediate grants that we can make in the wake of a tragedy, and will certainly be again this time. But the budget proposal does include funds and initiatives specifically to help schools elect to onboard social and emotional learning and mental health programs to really work at ensuring prevention of these sorts of tragedies.
Well, my time is up. So $100 million spread out across the 50 states.
Mr.
doesn't
Molinar.
seem to be adequate. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, Secretary DeVos, thank you for your answering questions and your just your patience with sometimes not even getting a chance to answer the question you were asked, and I appreciate all you've done. And I wanted to ask you on your federal work study proposal. Last year's budget, you had proposed reforms to the federal work study program. You have done that again this year to better target the funding to low-income recipients. And I wonder if you could comment on why does this federal work study program need these reforms? How does it assist low-income students better? And any other reforms in your budget to ensure that funds are best targeted to the students who need the funds most?
Well, thanks, Congressman. Yes, we believe the federal work study program needs reforms because the way the formula works today, very often those funds go to the most elite institutions, not the ones that are really serving the students with the most need. And so that's issue one. Secondly, work study as it's carried out today often involves students working in the college bookstore or in the cafeteria, on-campus programs. We have proposed to expand those options to allow students to potentially work with in an internship type, apprenticeship type opportunity with employers for whom they might ultimately move into a career with. And we think that having relevant work opportunities for students will be very meaningful in their learning career, and so that's part of our proposal as well.
I think that's a great idea. I think it meets a short-term need as well as really helping someone evaluate their future and what they might want to pursue long-term. What needs to happen to accomplish that? Is it legislative? Is it something that you can do? How do we accomplish that?
Well, it's part of our budget proposal, so Congress can, you all can discuss and take that up in your budget deliberations to allow the funds designated for that to be able to be used for those sorts of purposes.
Okay, thank you. And then just one last question on the teacher mentors. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because one of the things you hear periodically is that teachers come into the profession and many leave in the first 3 years. Is that something that this will help with that?
Good question. Thanks for asking that. We believe that this is a really two-track opportunity for new young teachers just coming into the profession to have a highly qualified, seasoned professional to come alongside them and help them, walk through their first few years in the profession is a great opportunity for new teachers. For those who are established and want to continue to really expand their reach and their ability to reach students, this gives them a really important career track and opportunity to do so and to continue to develop themselves and a career track for themselves. The best of the best, teaching young, new teachers is a great combination, and we should, I think, really embrace this wholeheartedly because it's ultimately going to be best for students.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Congresswoman Lee.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Your budget proposes to require post-secondary institutions that accept taxpayer funds in any way to have this, quote, skin in the game through a student loan risk-sharing program. But this program is not quite defined in the budget. Now, historically, black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutions enroll a large number of low-income students. The point of the Higher Education Act was to increase access to post-secondary education. And I want to ensure that as we move forward, we move toward increased access. But from the proposals that we've seen, there's a strong argument that risk sharing can incentivize institutions to only enroll those students of a certain means in an effort to not have to share in the risk if a student is unable to pay back their loans. So again, it could negatively harm minority-serving institutions and minority students. So how do you describe your proposal and how that, in the sense that it would not create a perverse incentive to not enroll low-income students? And then the second question I have, and you may need to get back to me on this, is the Congressional Black Caucus, we're deeply concerned about communications and advertising dollars from each agency. And so I'd like to know, and you have $1 million for communications program in your budget, how this money is contracted out in terms of the vendors, the media that you use to provide communications through Department of Ed in terms of minority, women-owned businesses and media. So if you could just get back to us with that written response.
Congresswoman, yes, if you could submit that for the record, we'll be happy to respond on that one. I can't respond on that right now. But as far as your first question and the proposal around risk sharing, it is a very broad proposal and not defined at all yet. We would look forward to working with you to develop a more concrete approach to ensuring that institutions have some kind of commitment to the students they're serving. I share your concerns. We share your concerns about ultimately impacting low-income students and more high-risk students disproportionately. So I think that we again would look forward to working with you and talking to you about ensuring we don't ultimately come forward with a proposal that would negatively impact the students that most need to have the kind of access you're talking about. And with regard to HBCUs, I just want to say that this administration has a very strong commitment to continuing to support HBCUs in their important work. And our proposal, our budget proposal, continues to fund all of the HBCU activities at levels as appropriated in 2019. And so, again, in the context of a reduced budget overall, I think it demonstrates our commitment to these institutions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. We'll get to you in writing some suggestions on how you can approach the risk-sharing program.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Watson-Coleman. Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Madam Secretary, how we spend our money or propose to spend it is an absolute reflection of our values. And as I look at this, you said Watson-Coleman? Yes, I did, but I made an error. Okay.
Lack of confusion here, or more confusion. Congressman Harris.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you
then Congressman Gray.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And Madam Secretary, you know, one of the things that I've noticed in the President's budget, and one of the things was mentioned, is the professional development, and kind of a different turn the administration wants to take in professional development. And, you know, I liken it to, as a physician, you know, we do continuing medical education, but obviously it's going to be different for every person. I mean, every person's at a different stage in their training, different stage in their experience. And, you know, a one-size-fits-a-few approach doesn't work for that, and I suspect it doesn't work for professional development for teachers as well. So could you just review, you know, the EIR program and kind of the, you know, what your proposal is for it and how it would change the way we deal with professional development?
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. This is a really important initiative, I think, that in our goal to really honor and respect the teaching profession and teachers, we want to give a couple of different tools to teachers specifically and give them more freedom to be the best they can be. And the proposal that we've put forward is a teacher voucher where teachers could pursue their professional development, customize it for their needs, and continue to themselves develop and perhaps share with their peers what they've learned, but give them a lot more freedom in that development. I've talked with dozens, hundreds of teachers across the country, and I hear repeatedly about, with very few exceptions, the area of personally developing, professionally developing is one that they deeply want to do, and yet they have very few opportunities and very little latitude in how to do that. And so this, we believe this is a really important proposal that we hope that you will consider very seriously.
Why is it? Because, I've got one of the studies that the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance produced, actually, which was from the Department of Education, that looked at middle school mathematics, professional development, where they, and I'm sure you're aware of these studies that show that we do these things for teachers, these things called professional development, but objectively, they just don't achieve the outcome. Why is it, you think, that what we're currently doing, and this is obviously important, mathematics is an important thing, that we'd want to make sure our teachers teach better. Why don't these programs currently work?
Well, I think very often they're a one-size-fits-all approach, or one dictated by the district or the school building, and there's very little latitude given to the teacher themselves as to whether or not this particular program to which they're assigned to go and learn from is going to actually help them in their profession and in their particular teaching style. So I think being able to choose and customize themselves is going to really allow them to really grow professionally in a way that they haven't been able to before.
Thank you very much. And Madam Chair, I'd like to move without objection that this study be entered into the record of the hearing. Thank you. I yield back.
Congresswoman Watson-Coleman. Sure? Yes.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. First of all, I want to say something about this rule that was rescinded. This was not supported by any of the civil rights community, and it would seem to me that that was a very viable entity to consider before you roll that rule back. Number two is you have the major advocate for education in this country admonished us in your statement for giving you too much money. So I just find that absolutely incredible. Number three is that I look at where your priorities are. At the same time, I look at where your decreases and program eliminations are. And it is very poignant to me that those programs that are particularly hurt address the minority populations, the poorer populations, the teachers in the schools that are struggling more, the TRIO programs and programs of that ilk that help young people get prepared for college. All of those programs address the children and the situations most in need. And there is more than a $7 billion cut in your budget from each one of those programs. And finally, I am going to give you the copy that I have of my Attorney General's letter so that you will have it in your possession now and be able to have your staff who already has it respond in a more expeditious manner. And I guess really, really finally is that you have eliminated a $200 billion teacher development program and replaced it with a $2 billion program. A $2 billion program you have eliminated, replacing it with a $200 million program to do the things that you say will give teachers an opportunity for development, personal development, innovative development, et cetera. That just doesn't fly. It just doesn't fly. It seems to me that a word that you use a lot in your discussion here today was about freedom. And from my perspective, from what I heard, freedom is not equal in your mind. I yield back.
Congresswoman Clark. No, Congressman Graves.
Yes, ma'am. Madam Secretary, thanks again. Just sort of wrapping up here. I've been here a little while this morning, this afternoon, and I hear a little bit of criticism about some spending decisions you've made. And might I just point out to the committee on your behalf that you're complying with law. I mean, the law says you can only spend so much money, and until Congress changes that number, you have to make tough decisions and tough choices. So I might refer to it as a little bit hypocritical criticism, because I've yet to see a comparison budget by the other side presented that would counter and show their spending priorities as it complies with current law as well. And until then, I would suggest they refrain from some of their criticism until they can compare it appropriately. Back to talking about college students. I'm a father of 2 college students, and we've been going through that process of making decisions over the last year and two, and it's difficult. It's really difficult to compel a student who has a desire and aspiration to go to a certain university with a certain degree in mind and program, and to try to convey to them that your potential income when you come out might not match the expense of what you're going to incur, because there is an expense. What can we do, or what is your department doing to help educate very educated students who are going into very demanding potential careers in the future, that the expense of a $250,000 loan to get a degree that might be very difficult to pay that off in the future, how do we get that message to them and help them make informed decision? Maybe it's a disclosure, maybe it's like might be done in real estate. You understand you're signing an agreement, and you understand that this might be the salary, but this is the cost, and here's your return on investment.
Well, thanks for that question, Congressman. And this is an area that we have been very focused on making progress on behalf of both students that are the customers and taxpayers. The Next Gen initiative in federal student aid is taking a very antiquated, complicated framework that has been patched together over the last couple decades and bringing it into the 21st century with a structure that is going to be a world-class experience for the student, the customer. Today, you can complete your federal student aid form on your smartphone through the My Student Aid app. Very soon, we're going to be adding really important information to that through the college scorecard. We're going to have program-level data by institution so students can look, if they're prospectively deciding between a number of institutions and a number of programs that they are thinking about pursuing, they're going to be able to find earnings data at the program level from that institution. And so it's going to give them a really important tool that they can use when they decide to take on that student debt to determine if that program is ultimately going to pay and ultimately going to be worth the investment they're talking about making.
Do you anticipate this tool will indicate the interest expense, the payment structure, if a loan were to be taken out, and income potential and growth over time, and how long it would take? Because I feel like parents are having to do a lot of that work on their own, and students get to the end of their career, college career, to enter in their next career, and they realize, wow, I have a lot of work to do, but I had other dreams. I wanted to start a family or buy a home, but now I can't. I wish I'd have known 4 years ago.
Well, I think in general, students need to have a lot more tools at their fingertips and they need to become much more financially literate as they make these decisions about their higher education pursuits. And so we can and will be providing a lot of data and a lot of tools for them to be able to know and understand what those implications are. We've proposed in this budget simplification of loan repayment, income-driven repayment program that would be capped at 12.5%. I think another area that is ripe for exploration, and which Mitch Daniels has instituted in a really important way at Purdue University,
Sorry, Madam
are income
Secretary,
sharing agreements.
We're about a minute and a half over here, Mr. Graves. I apologize, but we're trying to. Ms. Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, last year you came before us in answer to my question about a proposed budget cut to the student support and academic enrichment grants under ESSA. Since you had made that budget proposal in 2018, we had the shooting in Parkland. And I know that you were just putting together this commission that has now made recommendations that mental health treatment be provided and that we hire more school counselors and social workers, recognizing that the services are most effective when they are school-based. You said when I asked you about it that in light of what had transpired, quote, I support Congress's readdressing this and looking at this budget item because you said you supported, quote, ensuring schools have the resources that they need to keep kids safe. I understand your testimony today that the $3.8 billion in cuts that you've proposed is somehow squared with the $100 million that you've put in your budget to go to mental health. Could you explain your thinking, and has what you said to me last year changed?
Well, thanks, Congresswoman, for the question about the Title IV, a proposed elimination from the budget.
Yes.
I mentioned earlier the fact that this program has been very broad, very thinly spread, has not been designated specifically for school safety activities.
There was $234 million, though, correct, to safe and healthy school activities?
Which were, again, very broad. We believe the budget proposal, as we've submitted it today, is one that really helps target specific needs of states and local districts to—
Can you really help make, this week we've already mentioned the suicide of the Parkland student, which I share your heartbreak over that, but it just puts such a glaring light on the need for mental health services. And what I hear you saying is that with less than half of what the Title IV funds, somehow you think that's going to do a better job because those funds are too broad? Is that what you're saying?
Let's also take into account the fact that there are other specific activities, including mental health services in the budgets of HHS and in DOJ and DHS. And together, $700 million specifically for school safety activities. And there's actually more in those departments that could be used for—
So I'm hearing your testimony that, yes, reducing it by half is going to do it. Can you just answer for me something that was raised? Are any of that funding of the $200 million going to be allowed to purchase guns?
That's not the intention of the proposal.
Is that a no? Is that a no?
That is not the intention of the proposal. It is for mental health and social and emotional
learning. Is that a no then?
That would be totally up to this body to decide conclusively one way or the other. It's not the intention of our proposal.
Let me just now ask Ranking Member Cole if you have any further questions or any closing comments.
I'll close. I'm prepared to close, Madam Chair. Madam Secretary, first I just want to thank you. I hope it's well known how many years of service you've spent, and frankly, to try and make sure folks without access got access to good quality education long before you took this current job. And you certainly didn't need this job. You served without pay. You travel at your own expense. And I suspect you had better alternatives in front of you in terms of being more enjoyable, but you chose this, and you chose it because you care about young people and you care about educational opportunities. So where we may have occasional differences, I don't think anybody can doubt your commitment to the job and the willingness to sacrifice time and forego, again, if you want to call them the perks of the job. I think there are very few perks for the job that you have. And I want to thank you for that. And I think the mere fact you stayed here again longer than we normally go because you wanted to answer everybody's questions and concerns and present a case. I think that's very important. I think I ought to note, too, while we've had differences, there's some places we can clearly work on together. It seemed to me there was universal support for this idea of short-term Pell Grants that you mentioned. There's certainly strong support here for investments in career and vocational education. And obviously you share a lot of the priorities. I think my friend Mr. Graves pointed out, you do have to live within a constrained budget. You're writing your budget to the law. We think there'll probably be an agreement at some later point. We don't know that. You don't know that. And be pretty unwise for you to present a budget. But even within that constrained budget, as you point out, you made sure English learners, no cuts. IDEA, no cuts. Title I, no cuts. Those are our most vulnerable students. And I think with the dollars that you have, you've put those dollars where they reach people that are at the greatest risk of falling through the cracks in our educational system, and I want to thank you for that. So, again, just thank you for your service. Thank you for giving us extra time here today to ask tough questions, and I look forward to continuing to work with you as we go forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you as well, Madam Secretary, for being here and for staying on and continuing to answer questions. I think I just might say for a second that you get a sense of frustration, and it's particularly on our side of the aisle, and that's quite frankly, frustration stems from oftentimes the inability to get answers to questions, as it was demonstrated here today. I started out, and I won't pull any punches. This budget, in my view, is cruel. I think it is reckless. It's a 12% cut. It hurts middle-class families. It hurts working families. It hurts low-income families. And it's of concern to me. And again, as I laid out, I would hope that it's of concern to you. Why, on your watch as the Secretary of Education, do you want to be complicit in shutting off public education opportunities, which is the way that I see this. And my colleague talked about criticisms that have to do with a budget and so forth. No, we all used to working within a budget framework, but it is where you place your resources. What are your values? What are your priorities? That is what defines a budget, and that is what is of concern to all of us. I just want to just clarify a couple of things. With regard to charters being public, it's hard to compare charters to public education as we know it, because far too often what we see are charters siphoning away dollars from public schools. They are operated privately, and they do lack transparency. And we should expect that transparency from our public institutions. We apparently don't with regard to charters. And I want to say to you this morning or this afternoon, find the $1 billion. Find that $1 billion that was there. My colleague who is now gone, and you had an exchange with regard to international comparisons. Other countries blow us out of the water with investments in early childhood, wraparound services, which we know pay off in serious dividends. We have one of the lowest rates of lowest enrollment rates in early childhood education. And let me tell you, the HHS budget proposes to eliminate preschool development grants. We have level funded Head Start. We take on most of 15-year-olds in our school systems. Other countries don't do that. They take the highest achievers. So when you look at, you have to take that into consideration. The National Assessment of Educational Progress has shown large gains, which we should be proud of. For children of color over the past 3 decades. We have made gains. And we continue to denigrate our public education system, which leads me to the view that that's because the decision is to privatize this. I'm sorry that you didn't answer the questions on the mismanagement of the agency. With regard to short-term Pell, which everyone is extolling, but there's some pieces around that. What you failed to do is to talk about defining high quality. We need to have guardrails so we don't wind up in a Pell Grant program that's open to fraud, waste, and abuse. We need to have programs that may look at whether or not they are a good return on our investment for students and for the federal government. With regard to Next Gen, you did rescind the requirement that servicing contractors should comply with federal and state law, taking any necessary steps to support oversight by federal or state agencies, regulators, or law enforcement officials. You rescinded the requirement around strengthening transparency through expanded publication of aggregate data on student loan and servicer performances. That would have required the Department of Education to publish servicer-level data on default. None of these rescinded provisions are currently part of the department's Next Gen effort. You know, you said and you discussed that these are just proposals. I'm relieved. I'm relieved that they are just proposals because the damage that your budget would inflict on children and on families, that I look forward to working with my colleagues across the aisle to reject the cuts and act a forward-looking agenda to improve the lives of American families. And we have strived to do that over the last several years on this committee. So we will be reviewing what has been proposed. And you can be assured, and I hope, that we are going to reject much of what is here, as we have in the past, because the center of the Department of Education is the 90% of our kids who are in public education. We ought to be focused like a laser on their opportunities and their future. And yes, look at innovation, test whether or not it's good, and be prepared to say no when it is not working. Thank you, and let me draw this hearing to a close. Thank you.
No, it's usually just the two. Okay, great. So, guys, we won the I saw Yes.